All right, Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst on defense strategy and capability at ASPI, which is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for talking to us about Ukraine and what's happening on the ground there. Do you get a sense from what you're able to read, from what you're able to see, and can you see through some of the smoke on the battlefield? And do you feel that Russia is progressing or Russia is stalled?
Look, I think that the picture is uneven, but certainly the indications are that the Russians have learned a lot of lessons from their past failure in the first phase of the war, where they tried to essentially do a coup de main and capture Kiev. That failed miserably because they threw out the lessons of combined armed operations and left their logistics train behind and didn't support their ground forces with air power. They did everything wrong basically in that first phase. So they've gone back. They're now focusing very much on the Donbass region around Severodonetsk, with the aim being to capture that, and then Kramatorsk. And I think they are learning, they're adapting, they're starting to make progress and starting to gain momentum. Now, whether they can sustain that momentum in a manner that enables them to continue to advance and capture Kramatorsk, to essentially encircle the Ukrainian forces that are extended way forward in a salient towards Severodonetsk, is the key question. If they can do that, if they can encircle those Ukrainian forces and ultimately wear them down in the same way that they wore down the defenders in Mariupol in the south, then they have a significant victory on their hands. But the question is, can they do that? Do they have the material that is effective? Is the morale good enough, or is it going to stall? If it stalls, then we're into a stagnant stalemate.
None of this is good news for Ukraine right now, which continues to receive weapon shipments from the West. Much is being made about some of these multiple launch rocket systems that President Biden has promised them that give them increased range of 50 miles. So those weapon shipments are helping them hold on, but they don't seem to be turning the battle right now.
Well, there's only 4 HIMARS batteries that the Ukrainians are getting. They're getting the M270 rockets, which have about a 70-kilometer range. So they're not the long-range ATACMS missiles. They obviously are fighting very well. That I think they've absolutely shamed the Russians in terms of demonstrating how effective the Ukrainians really are. But whether it's enough to actually beat back the Russians to the extent that they're imposing a decisive and visible defeat on the Russians in the breadth and length of Ukraine is another question. And really, that's what's needed. We need to impose a decisive defeat on Russia. Now, of course, the risks.
So then how do you do that, if I can jump in there? Because if you're saying the existing weapon shipments haven't done the trick, it sounds like they're going to have to do more.
You're going to need greater numbers of weapons from the West in greater quantities, with greater emphasis on long-range firepower, heavier weapon systems. In other words, javelins alone aren't enough. We need more emphasis on long-range firepower, greater emphasis on the Ukrainians acquiring armored forces and drones and surveillance capabilities to identify locations where the Russians are and strike at those locations. So my point is that the Western liberal democracies really need to step up to the plate and start accelerating and broadening the delivery of material military support to the Ukrainians.
They would say they've already done that, and yet it doesn't appear to change the battlefield that much.
They would, but I think they could do a lot more. I'm certainly not advocating, a no-fly zone or anything like that, but I think that Western democracies, particularly the NATO states and the European states, need to do a lot more. Germany in particular needs to do a lot more. And I think that once you start flowing those material supplies to the Ukrainians in depth and breadth, then you start to change the indicators on the ground the Russians, which are suffering from fragmented, broken forces as a result of the first phase of the war, will find it less easy to compete and reconstitute. And so their position then starts to look very precarious.
Would you hazard to make a guess on how long this is going to go?
I think this is going to go for several months. This is not going to be over anytime soon. I think that we could still be having this discussion this time next year and it'll still be going. Now, of course, the risk is that the longer it goes on, a number of things could happen. Firstly, as more weapons flow into Ukraine from the West, Russia could decide to escalate and attack those supply lines directly in NATO, and that leads to a wider war between NATO and Russia. Secondly, if the Russians begin really losing badly, they could escalate to either chemical weapons use or even a tactical nuclear weapon use as part of escalate to de-escalate. That's a scenario that I think everyone is very conscious of. There's also a third scenario of the West having to do something to open up the supply of wheat out of the southern coast to world markets, because Russia...
You said you wouldn't advocate a no-fly zone. Would you advocate some kind of UN or even NATO force to open up those sea lanes out of Odessa?
That's certainly something that's being considered. And I think that if we don't do something like that, then the world is going to face a very serious food shortage. And Russia understands this, and it's ruthlessly exploiting that in the hope, I think, of trying to convince the West to convince Ukraine to accept a settlement that makes it surrender territory, sort of thing that Kissinger was talking about a few weeks back. We shouldn't play into that game. I do think we need to force open those sea lanes and open those coasts. Now, the risk is, of course, that if we do that, the Russians could decide to intervene against us, but they have to understand that if they do that, if there's direct conflict between NATO and Russia at sea in the Black Sea, then the risks of escalation, are just as bad for them as they are for us. And so they lose as well.
You're not the first person to tell me that. And I've heard it from there is obviously a very large international conversation that's taking place, which advocates, and very quickly, opening up those sea lanes, whether Russia will negotiate it or whether Russia wants it or not, because you have the new harvest. The old harvest is sitting in silos. The new harvest, within a matter of weeks, should be making its way to Mariupol. They cannot move enough of that over rail through Poland. They've got to rely on those sea routes. So, amongst your colleagues, and I know you talk to people around the world, do you think that there is real international traction now on forcing the Black Sea issue and removing Russia's blockade?
Well, I think the risk is that if we don't, then you are going to see global food shortages that could lead to millions of people dying, across the world in third world countries. So how do we sort of balance the risk of an operation at sea to open those sea lanes and those ports, knowing that it could see potential for direct clash between, say, for example, a UN naval force and Russia, versus the risk of, or the certainty of, a global food crisis that could last months and lead to many deaths. It's a really difficult call because obviously any direct clash could lead to a wider war with obvious implications of escalation to nuclear weapons. But if we don't, then we have a really serious global food crisis that could last many months and not get any better, because the Russians are not going to willingly give up that south coast. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer to this one.
Can I, as a last question, ask you, what do you think victory looks like for President Putin right now? Do you think that he would be content biting off a big part of eastern Ukraine, this land bridge to the Crimea, and stopping short of Odessa and not circling around and reattacking Kiev? Or do you think it's really a question of time and what they're able to accomplish on the ground?
I think from Putin's perspective, he still wants all of Ukraine. So his initial theory of victory will be controlling the Donbass and the south coast, and basically getting Ukraine to accept that, as well as neutrality. But then down the track, once Russia has reformed its military capability and rebuilt those forces, he'll launch another war to take Kiev. I don't think he's going to be sated simply by the Donbass and the South Coast. So we are facing the prospect of an ongoing threat here. It's not going to go away. And I think this is why it's really a bad move on the part of the West if we essentially give Russia the Donbass and the South Coast to try and, let's put it bluntly, ensure peace in our time.
All the more reason that you hear people like President Biden say that they're not going to impose terms and conditions on Ukraine. In the end, it will be up to Ukraine to accept what they will take at the negotiating table or what they won't. And obviously, Ukraine is probably not going to accept allowing Russia to occupy and claim all of that territory of Eastern Ukraine.
Right. So the challenge we face then is how do we impose a defeat on Russia to deter them from doing this again in the future without risking Putin reaching for escalate to de-escalate with a tactical nuclear weapon or going with attacks on NATO directly. That's the challenge we face in the coming months, is how if we're supplying the Ukrainians and we're standing with them to ensure that they can defeat the Russian forces on the ground, the risk is that once it becomes clear to Russia that they are losing and losing badly, Putin may escalate. So how we avoid that whilst imposing a defeat is the real challenge for the West, and I'm not sure, to be honest, it's a possible outcome that we're going to achieve.
Malcolm Davis, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.